Welcome to Crime Pulse Stories, where we uncover the darkest mysteries that continue to captivate and baffle. Today, we unravel the infamous Lizzie Borden case, a story that intertwines family conflict, societal expectations, and one of the most brutal double murders in American history. Was Lizzie Borden a cold blooded killer, or was she the victim of a tragic series of events? Over the next 20 sections, we'll piece together the evidence, uncover motives, and explore the chilling details of this enduring mystery. Stay with me as we dive into the haunting tale of the Borden family murders. Our story begins in Fall River, Massachusetts, a booming mill town of the late 19th century. At its peak, Fall River was the heart of New England's textile industry, home to a mix of wealthy mill owners and hardworking factory laborers. This economic divide created a stark contrast between the affluent few and the struggling many. The Borden family lived in the center of this bustling town, in a modest house on 2nd Street. Unlike the opulent mansions of the city's elite, their home reflected Andrew Borden's austere approach to life. Despite being a wealthy man, Andrew's refusal to spend on luxuries or relocate to a more fashionable neighborhood set the family apart and perhaps sowed seeds of resentment. The town itself, with its mix of opportunity and tension, forms the backdrop for the events that would soon unfold. In a place where appearances mattered and reputations could make or break families, the Bordens were an anomaly. This quiet town, brimming with ambition and secrecy, was about to become the stage for a crime that would shock the nation. To understand the Lizzie Borden case, we must first step inside the walls of the Borden household. At its center was Andrew Borden, a wealthy yet notoriously frugal patriarch. Despite his significant wealth, Andrew lived modestly, refusing to indulge in the comforts that many of Fall River's elite enjoyed. This rigid austerity created friction within the family, particularly with his daughters. Abby Borden, Andrew's second wife, faced constant tension from Lizzie and her older sister Emma. The two women resented Abby, believing she was more concerned with her own family than theirs. They even refused to call her mother, instead referring to her as Mrs. Borden. The atmosphere in the home grew colder when Andrew gifted a property to Abby's relatives, deepening the daughter's resentment. Emma, the elder daughter, was reserved and often served as Lizzie's protector. Lizzie, on the other hand, was outspoken and headstrong. By her early 30s, Lizzie remained unmarried and dependent on her father's financial control, a situation uncommon and perhaps stifling for a woman of her age and ambitions at the time. The family dynamics were strained at best. Meals were often silent, with little warmth shared among the household members. This cold and tense environment formed a powder keg of emotions, setting the stage for the explosive events to come. Beneath the surface, jealousy, resentment, and frustration brewed, waiting for a spark. The morning of August 4th, 1892, began like any other in the Borden household, but by midday it would descend into horror. Andrew left the house early to attend to his business affairs, as he did every morning. Abby, ever diligent, began her household chores, assigning the maid, Bridget Sullivan, the unenviable task of cleaning the windows in the sweltering summer heat. Lizzie claimed to have been in the house that morning but was vague about her activities. At some point, Abby made her way upstairs to tidy the guest bedroom. It was there, sometime between 9 and 10 in the morning, that she was attacked. Struck repeatedly with a hatchet, Abby fell face down to the floor, her lifeless body hidden from view in the upstairs room. Andrew returned home around 10:30, appearing unaware of the horror that had unfolded in his own house. He decided to rest on the sofa in the sitting room. Minutes later, he too was attacked. His head struck with the same ferocity as Abby's. The brutal blows left him unrecognizable. Bridget, who had retreated to her room after completing her chores, later testified that she heard nothing unusual, a chilling detail given the violence of the attacks. Lizzie's account was equally puzzling. She claimed she was in the barn loft during the murders, a curious alibi that raised as many questions as it answered. By late morning, the quiet household was transformed into a scene of carnage. Two murders, committed with shocking precision, left investigators baffled. How could such a violent act occur in a house with three occupants and remain unseen or unheard? The morning's events were cloaked in silence, leaving behind only bloodstains and unanswered questions. The scene that greeted the first responders at the Borden home was one of unrelenting brutality. Andrew Borden's body was discovered first, sprawled on the sitting room sofa. His face had borne the brunt of the attack struck repeatedly with a hatchet. His features were rendered unrecognizable. Blood pooled beneath his head, soaking into the fabric of the sofa and the carpet below. Strangely, the rest of his body appeared untouched, suggesting he had been taken by complete surprise. Upstairs in the guest bedroom lay Abby Borden's body. She had been attacked from behind, the fatal blows crushing her skull. Her body was found face down, her arms bent awkwardly, as though she had tried to shield herself in her final moments. Blood spatter across the walls and floor suggested a frenzied attack. Unlike Andrew, Abby's body showed signs of resistance, indicating she may have been aware of her assailant. The house itself provided little in the way of clear evidence. The narrow, compact layout of the home meant any movement could have been seen or heard, yet no one reported hearing screams or cries for help. Investigators searched for signs of forced entry, but found none. Whoever had committed these acts either had access to the house or knew its layout well enough to move through it without detection. Adding to the mystery was the apparent lack of a murder weapon. Though hatchets and other tools were later found in the basement, none were immediately identified as the one used in the killings. The crime scene was a puzzle, brutal, intimate, and inexplicably silent. Lizzie's account of the events that morning was as puzzling as the crime scene itself. When questioned by the authorities, she claimed she had been in the barn loft, searching for lead sinkers to use for a fishing trip. She insisted she had heard nothing unusual and only discovered her father's body when she returned to the house. Lizzie's calm demeanor during these initial interactions struck many as odd. She appeared composed, even detached, as she recounted finding her father's mutilated body. When asked about her stepmother, she told police that Abby had gone out earlier in the morning after receiving a note from a sick friend. This explanation quickly unraveled when Abby's body was found upstairs, with no sign of the alleged note. Her alibi of being in the barn also raised eyebrows. Investigators found the barn to be sweltering, filled with dust and cobwebs, an unlikely spot for anyone to linger on a hot summer morning. Moreover, Bridget Sullivan, the family's maid, reported seeing Lizzie inside the house during the critical time frame of the murders, further complicating her story. Lizzie's initial statements were riddled with inconsistencies. She changed minor details about her movements and seemed unable to provide a clear timeline of the morning's events. While these discrepancies might have been attributed to shock or confusion, they also planted the seeds of suspicion. Was Lizzie merely a traumatized witness, or was she weaving a narrative to distance herself from the crime? As investigators pressed Lizzie for answers, her calmness became a point of fascination and unease. In a house filled with silence and bloodshed, her version of events only deepened the mystery. Was this the reaction of an innocent woman, or did it hint at something darker beneath the surface? Lizzie Borden's inquest testimony became one of the most scrutinized elements of the investigation. Over the course of 3 days, she faced relentless questioning from District Attorney Hosea Knowlton, and her responses only deepened the suspicions against her. From the outset, Lizzie's demeanor during the inquest was unsettling. She appeared calm, detached, and at times evasive. Her answers often contradicted previous statements, and she seemed unable or unwilling to provide a coherent timeline of her actions on the morning of the murders. One of the most glaring inconsistencies was Lizzie's account of her whereabouts. While she initially claimed she had been in the barn loft during Andrew's murder under oath, her story shifted. She said she may have been in the kitchen or the dining room, but couldn't recall exactly. This vagueness, coupled with the confined layout of the house, raised questions about how she could have failed to hear the attacks. Lizzie's explanation of Abby's absence was equally problematic. She reiterated that Abby had left the house after receiving a note from a sick friend. Yet, when pressed for details, Lizzie admitted she hadn't seen the note herself and couldn't say who might have sent it. With Abby's body lying upstairs, this statement appeared not only implausible but deliberately misleading. Her demeanor was another point of contention. While Lizzie's defense later argued that her behavior reflected shock, critics viewed her composure as cold and calculating. She frequently deflected questions, offering vague or contradictory answers, which the prosecution interpreted as attempts to obscure the truth. The inquest testimony became a turning point in the case. While Lizzie did not directly incriminate herself, her inconsistent statements and stoic demeanor painted her as a suspicious figure. Was she a grieving daughter struggling to process trauma, or was she a cunning murderer carefully weaving a web of half truths? The jury and the public were left to decide. The story of the mysterious note Lizzie claimed Abby received on the morning of August 4th added another layer of intrigue to the case. According to Lizzie, the note summoned Abby out of the house to tend to a sick friend. This explanation was meant to account for Abby's absence, yet it fell apart almost immediately when her body was discovered upstairs. Despite a thorough search of the house and surrounding area, the note was never found. Lizzie suggested that Abby might have destroyed it before leaving, but this seemed improbable given its alleged importance. Bridget Sullivan, the Borden maid, testified that she had neither seen Abby leave the house nor heard her mention receiving a note that morning. Investigators were quick to challenge the credibility of Lizzie's story. The note's existence seemed designed to deflect attention away from the fact that Abby had been upstairs at the time of her murder. Was it a convenient fabrication to buy Lizzie time and create confusion? Or was it a detail invented in panic, with no thought to how it might unravel? The mysterious note became a key point of contention during the trial. While the defense argued that its absence didn't prove it never existed, the prosecution framed it as an intentional lie to cover Lizzie's tracks. If there was no note, they contended, Lizzie's entire explanation of Abby's movements and her own innocence crumbled. This small but significant detail encapsulated the ambiguity of the case. Was it a simple misunderstanding or a calculated effort to mislead? Like so much else in the Lizzie Borden saga, the truth about the note remains shrouded in doubt, leaving behind a lingering question that adds to the enduring mystery of the murders. One of the most peculiar and suspicious moments in the aftermath of the Borden murders occurred just days after the crime. Lizzie Borden was seen by a witness burning a dress in the kitchen stove. The dress was described as light colored, and Lizzie claimed it had been irreparably stained with paint. While this explanation might seem innocuous at first, the timing of the act raised significant doubts. The incident was reported by Alice Russell, a family friend who stayed at the Borden home to provide support following the murders. Alice testified that she saw Lizzie feeding pieces of the dress into the flames. When questioned, Lizzie dismissed the act as routine, insisting the dress was unusable. However, investigators suspected the dress might have been worn during the murders and burned to destroy incriminating evidence. Forensic analysis in the 19th century was rudimentary, and the absence of physical evidence linking Lizzie to the crime was a major hurdle for investigators. If the dress had contained bloodstains, it could have been the key piece of evidence needed to tie Lizzie directly to the murders. Its destruction, whether intentional or coincidental, effectively removed that possibility. During the trial, the prosecution pointed to this incident as proof of Lizzie's guilt, arguing that her behavior was inconsistent with innocence. The defense, however, countered that burning an old dress was a common practice and that Lizzie's actions had been unfairly scrutinized due to the circumstances. With no concrete proof linking the dress to the crime, the act remained a troubling yet inconclusive detail. This moment became emblematic of the Borden case as a whole, an act steeped in ambiguity that left as many questions as it answered. Was Lizzie simply disposing of an unusable garment, or was this a calculated move to erase the final traces of her involvement in the murders? Among the most intriguing details to surface during the investigation was Lizzie Borden's alleged attempt to purchase prussic acid the day before the murders. Prussic acid, a highly toxic substance, was often used as a pesticide, but was also a well-known poison. Lizzie reportedly entered a local pharmacy and requested a small amount, claiming she needed it to clean a sealskin cape. The pharmacist, suspicious of the request, refused to sell the compound without proper authorization. This refusal meant no prussic acid was obtained, but the incident raised red flags when investigators learned of it. Why would Lizzie seek such a dangerous substance just one day before the murders? Was she planning an alternate method to carry out the crime, only to resort to the hatchet when her plan was thwarted? The defense was quick to dismiss this incident as irrelevant. They argued there was no evidence to connect the prussic acid attempt to the murders and pointed out that no poison had been used in the crime. The judge agreed, and the testimony was excluded from the trial. However, in the court of public opinion, the story added to the growing perception of Lizzie as a premeditated and calculating figure. For investigators, the prussic acid attempt suggested an element of planning. It raised the possibility that Lizzie had considered multiple methods of eliminating her father and stepmother, ultimately resorting to a more violent approach when poison became unavailable. While it didn't directly tie Lizzie to the murders, the incident became another piece in the puzzle, a chilling glimpse into what may have been a broader plan. As with many aspects of the case, the prussic acid incident remains steeped in ambiguity. Was it a simple misunderstanding, an unrelated errand, or a sinister prelude to one of the most infamous crimes in American history? The truth remains as elusive as ever, leaving behind another haunting question in the Lizzie Borden mystery. Bridget Sullivan, the Borden family's maid, found herself unwillingly thrust into the center of the investigation. An Irish immigrant, Bridget had been employed by the Bordens for several years, handling the household's daily chores and navigating the tense atmosphere within the home. On the day of the murders, Her presence in the house made her both a key witness and a potential suspect in the eyes of the investigators. Bridget's account of the morning was straightforward. She stated that Abby had instructed her to wash the windows, a task she dreaded due to the intense summer heat. While Bridget worked outside and later rested in her attic room, she claimed to have heard no signs of a struggle or cries for help. This detail puzzled investigators, given the violent nature of the murders and the proximity of the rooms. When Lizzie called for her after discovering Andrew's body, Bridget was the first to see the grisly aftermath. She promptly ran for help, alerting neighbors and summoning the authorities. During the investigation, Bridget's testimony about the strained relationships within the Borden family, particularly between Lizzie and Abby, provided crucial context for establishing motive. However, questions lingered. How could Bridget, present in the house, have been unaware of two brutal murders occurring just rooms away? Some speculated that Bridget might have had a role in the killings, fueled by resentment over her treatment by the Bordens. Yet, no evidence ever tied her to the crime, and her consistent, cooperative behavior led authorities to dismiss her as a suspect. Ultimately, Bridget's testimony painted a picture of a household rife with tension and unease. While she may have held her own frustrations, her account was crucial in piecing together the timeline and dynamics of the day's events. Her role remains that of a bystander caught in the web of one of America's most notorious crimes. The discovery of a hatchet head in the Borden basement became a cornerstone of the investigation, offering a possible link to the horrific injuries inflicted on Andrew and Abby. When police searched the home, they found several tools in the basement, but one item stood out: a hatchet head with no handle, appearing to have been recently cleaned. The significance of this find was immediately apparent. The blows to both victims' skulls suggested a weapon like a hatchet had been used. The broken handle seemed to indicate an attempt to destroy or dispose of incriminating evidence. Investigators theorized that the killer had removed the handle and wiped the blade clean to avoid detection. However, the hatchet's evidentiary value was far from clear cut. Forensic science in the late 19th century was rudimentary, and no blood or tissue traces were definitively found on the blade. Additionally, the police's handling of the evidence was criticized, as the crime scene had been poorly secured, and items in the house were moved and touched by multiple people before being examined. Lizzie's defense team capitalized on these uncertainties. They argued that the hatchet could not be conclusively linked to the murders and suggested it was simply an old, discarded tool unrelated to the crime. They also highlighted the lack of direct evidence tying Lizzie to the weapon, pointing to the absence of blood on her person or clothing as further proof of her innocence. Despite these challenges, the hatchet head became a powerful symbol of the crime. It represented the brutal, calculated nature of the murders and the chilling precision with which the killer operated. Was it the weapon that ended Andrew and Abby's lives, or was it another red herring in a case riddled with ambiguity? Like much of the evidence in the Borden murders, the hatchet left behind more questions than answers, ensuring its place in the haunting legacy of the case. The Borden murders ignited a media firestorm that transformed Lizzie Borden into one of the most infamous figures of her time. Newspapers across the country devoured the grisly details, turning the crime into a sensationalized spectacle. Headlines emphasized the brutality of the murders, the wealth of the Borden family, and the shocking possibility that a respectable, unmarried woman might have committed such a heinous act. Lizzie's portrayal in the press was divisive. On one hand, some publications painted her as a demure churchgoer, incapable of the violence she was accused of. Victorian ideals of femininity clashed with the horror of the crime, creating disbelief among her supporters. How could a woman, especially one from such a prominent family, wield a hatchet in cold blood? On the other hand, tabloids sensationalized her as a cunning killer, calculating and emotionless. Reports of her calm demeanor, her dress burning, and her inconsistent testimony fueled public suspicion. Political cartoons and speculative articles portrayed her as a symbol of societal hypocrisy, a woman who defied the traditional mold, yet may have exploited it to avoid suspicion. This media frenzy affected every aspect of the case. Public opinion swayed from outrage to fascination, with many convinced of Lizzie's guilt and others rallying to her defense. The courtroom became a stage for drama, with journalists chronicling every detail and feeding the public's insatiable appetite for scandal. Lizzie's trial was not just a legal proceeding, but a cultural phenomenon, shaping her legacy as much as the evidence itself. As the investigation into the Borden murders progressed, the weight of public scrutiny and mounting evidence pushed authorities toward formal action. In November, a grand jury convened to decide whether Lizzie Borden should face trial for the murders of Andrew and Abby Borden. The proceedings were secretive, but the evidence presented to the jury painted a damning picture. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Hosea Knowlton, presented the key elements of their case. Lizzie's inconsistent statements, her presence in the house during the murders, and the peculiar incidents such as the dress burning and the prussic acid attempt were all highlighted. The discovery of the hatchet head in the basement further bolstered their argument. While circumstantial, the evidence suggested Lizzie had both the motive and opportunity to commit the crime. The defense, spearheaded by Andrew Jennings, worked to counter these claims. They emphasized the lack of direct evidence, pointing out that no blood was found on Lizzie's clothing and that the murder weapon had not been definitively identified. They also argued that Lizzie's calm demeanor and conflicting statements were the result of shock and grief, not guilt. Ultimately, the grand jury was persuaded by the prosecution's narrative. In December, Lizzie was formally indicted on 2 counts of murder. The decision set the stage for what would become one of the most infamous trials in American history. The indictment was a pivotal moment in the case. It represented a commitment to bring Lizzie to justice, or at least to uncover the truth. Yet, it also highlighted the fragility of the evidence against her. The trial that followed would test the limits of what could be proven in a case built on suspicion, circumstance, and public intrigue. On a warm June morning, Lizzie Borden's trial began in New Bedford, Massachusetts, drawing an unprecedented crowd of reporters, spectators, and curious onlookers. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation. For the next 2 weeks, the world would turn its attention to this small New England town, captivated by the drama of the proceedings. The trial was presided over by a panel of 3 judges, an unusual arrangement that reflected the case's complexity and high-profile nature. District Attorney Hosea Knowlton led the prosecution, with William H. Moody, a skilled orator, assisting. The defense team was equally formidable, headed by Andrew Jennings and George Robinson, a former governor of Massachusetts. Both sides brought their sharpest minds, knowing that this trial would determine not only Lizzie's fate, but also their own legacies. Lizzie sat quietly throughout the proceedings, dressed in modest yet fashionable attire. She appeared calm and composed, her demeanor scrutinized at every turn by both the court and the public. The atmosphere in the courtroom was electric, with every piece of evidence and every word of testimony dissected by the audience. The trial was not just a legal battle, It was a cultural phenomenon that would shape public perceptions of crime, gender, and justice for decades to come. The prosecution's strategy was clear. They needed to convince the jury that Lizzie Borden had both the motive and opportunity to commit the murders. While their case lacked direct evidence, they built a narrative rooted in circumstantial facts and unsettling behaviors. Their primary focus was on Lizzie's relationship with her stepmother, Abby Borden. They argued that Lizzie harbored deep resentment toward Abby, fueled by financial disputes and familial tensions. This motive, combined with Lizzie's presence in the house during the murders, formed the foundation of their argument. The prosecution also highlighted Lizzie's actions following the murders. They pointed to her inconsistent statements, the burning of the dress, and her alleged attempt to purchase prussic acid as evidence of a guilty conscience. The discovery of the hatchet head in the basement was presented as a possible murder weapon, with prosecutors suggesting that Lizzie had cleaned it to remove incriminating traces. Key witnesses, including Bridget Sullivan and neighbors, were called to testify. Their accounts painted a picture of a tense household and a suspect who appeared unnervingly calm in the face of tragedy. The prosecution's case was compelling in its narrative, but its reliance on circumstantial evidence left room for doubt. They needed the jury to connect the dots and see Lizzie as the only plausible culprit. The defense's approach was to dismantle the prosecution's case piece by piece, creating enough doubt to secure Lizzie's acquittal. They focused on three main points: the lack of direct evidence, the implausibility of Lizzie committing the murders unnoticed, and her consistent character as a devoted daughter and churchgoer. First, the defense hammered home the absence of physical evidence. No blood was found on Lizzie's person or clothing, and the alleged murder weapon could not be definitively linked to the crime. The hatchet head, they argued, was a red herring and old, discarded tool that had nothing to do with the murders. Second, they emphasized the physical layout of the house. How, they asked, could Lizzie commit two brutal murders in broad daylight without being heard by Bridget or neighbors? The defense suggested that an intruder, possibly someone with a grudge against Andrew, could have entered and escaped undetected. Finally, they portrayed Lizzie as a victim of circumstance. Her calm demeanor, they argued, was a reflection of her stoic nature, not guilt. They called witnesses who testified to her kindness, religious devotion, and lack of violent tendencies, painting her as a woman wrongfully accused due to societal biases. The defense's strategy was effective in raising doubts. While the prosecution presented a plausible narrative, the defense countered with questions that the evidence simply couldn't answer. In a case built on circumstantial facts, the defense's ability to sow uncertainty proved to be a formidable weapon. After weeks of gripping testimony, the trial culminated in the jury's deliberation. The 11 men and one foreman faced the daunting task of determining whether Lizzie Borden was guilty of the brutal murders of her father and stepmother. The lack of direct evidence and reliance on circumstantial arguments weighed heavily on their decision. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours, emerging with a verdict that shocked many: not guilty. They cited the absence of physical proof tying Lizzie to the murders and the reasonable doubts skillfully introduced by the defense. For some, the verdict reflected a justice system that had acted fairly, while others believed Lizzie's gender, social status, and demeanor had shielded her from a conviction. Lizzie's reaction in court was uncharacteristically emotional. For the first time, she showed visible relief, tears streaming down her face as the weight of the trial lifted. Outside the courtroom, reactions were divided. Supporters celebrated her vindication, while skeptics believed a murderer had walked free. Following her acquittal, Lizzie Borden's life was far from a return to normalcy. She and her sister Emma used their inheritance to move to a more affluent part of Fall River, purchasing a grand home they named Maplecroft. However, Lizzie's reputation never recovered. She was ostracized by the community, with whispers of her guilt following her everywhere. Lizzie, determined to embrace her newfound wealth, indulged in luxuries she had been denied during her father's lifetime. Yet, the stigma of the trial shadowed her until her death. Her relationship with Emma eventually deteriorated, and the sisters lived separate lives. Lizzie died in relative isolation, her name forever linked to one of the most notorious crimes in American history. Over the years, numerous theories about the Borden murders have emerged. Some believe Bridget Sullivan, fed up with years of mistreatment, lashed out in a moment of rage. Others point to Andrew Borden's business dealings, suggesting the murders were the work of someone seeking revenge. A more sensational theory implicates Emma, who was conveniently out of town during the murders. Could she have orchestrated the crime or returned secretly to carry it out? Still others propose that an unknown intruder, exploiting the unlocked door, entered the house to commit the gruesome act. None of these theories have been proven, and no new evidence has surfaced to challenge Lizzie's acquittal. The absence of definitive answers has ensured the case's place as a cornerstone of true crime history. The Lizzie Borden case continues to captivate and perplex. Modern forensic experts have revisited the evidence, applying contemporary techniques to analyze the timeline, the crime scene, and Lizzie's behavior. Yet, the lack of physical evidence and the contamination of the crime scene have left the case unresolved. Historians and psychologists have explored the societal context of the trial, examining how gender norms, media sensationalism, and class dynamics influenced perceptions of Lizzie's guilt. Was she an innocent woman caught in the crossfire of public outrage, or a shrewd killer who exploited societal biases to evade justice? The enduring mystery lies not just in who committed the murders, but in why they remain unsolved. The Lizzie Borden case is a reminder of the limitations of justice in the face of ambiguity, and its legacy endures as both a cautionary tale and a source of endless fascination. As we conclude our deep dive into the Lizzie Borden case, the haunting question remains: could Lizzie have been innocent, or did she outsmart the justice system? The lack of answers ensures this case will continue to provoke debate and curiosity for generations to come. What do you think? Was Lizzie wrongfully accused, or did she escape conviction through luck and privilege? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's keep the discussion alive. Thank you for joining us on Crime Pulse Stories, where we explore the darkest mysteries and invite you to uncover the truth with us. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more gripping cases. See you next time.